The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
We're back. We are those guys. It is a Fantasy Friday here on the program. There we go. There's our official branding. No better day than Friday, I think, Nick, because you're coming off the start of the new football week. You've already done your waiver wire pickups. You're scrambling to see who to start, who to sit, those types of things. That's not necessarily the angle that we're coming at, but Nick Ferguson, former 10-year NFL safety, here with me. I'm noticing some certain trends from week one. Our theme for the Those Guys NFL show is to not overreact to week one, but in certain ways with fantasy football, you take calculated risks. If you overreact to a certain extent, you can catch on certain trends, be ahead of the curve, and if you're wrong, you just dump that player anyway and you move on to the next thing to overreact to. I think the perfect example would be going in on Jordan Mason before understanding the full scope of the Christian McCaffrey injury throughout the summer. So Nick Ferguson, what's going on, my man? How'd you fare for fantasy football week one in the books?
Hey man, it's week one. I didn't really want to overreact, and what I'm telling you is I did not win.
Oh no!
Yeah, man, there were a couple of players who definitely underperformed, but here's the upside to it, because you always have to look at the bright side and the silver lining of every dark cloud.
Yes, you're a glass half full guy.
Yeah, it's only week one, and the same thing happened to me last year, and guess what? I won the entire league.
That's why Nick Ferguson is here headlining the fantasy football show. He is a champion, where it counts most, not a Super Bowl champion, but a fantasy football championship. I think something everyone would strive for comparative to what you can do on the actual gridiron. Yes. Disappointed with your week one performance, Nick. I'm sure you're not the only one. This week one opening, teams averaged 188 net passing yards, the fewest in any week since week 15 in 2007. Nick Ferguson, I believe, a member of the Houston Texans at the time. We saw that this was almost 30% less passing yardage from week one 5 years ago, where teams averaged north of 260 yards in that week one. We had two 300-yard passers, Tua Tagovailoa and Matthew Stafford. Meanwhile, more than half the league under 200 passing yards. So, Nick, we're talking about an all-time, like decades in the making, lack of production in the passing offenses. We sort of touched on this briefly in the main football show, which you can grab in the same podcast. Those just you get your podcast, YouTube as well. But my thought process here, Nick, is we saw some 2007 offense, Nick. We had nearly, we had more 100-yard rushers than we've had in recent years. Were we wrong to be drafting all these receivers early, banking on safe, stable production from the elite guys that we were hoping for in the first couple of rounds? Or is this just sort of an extension of the preseason, like you had alluded to on our previous show?
It's a microcosm of several things. Extension of the preseason is one, but also the defensive units playing their best ball in week one. Now, obviously, that's subject to change later on as the season goes on. But for me, I didn't start out my draft taking a lot of wide receivers.
That's true. You went heavy with the running backs. And Bijan and Kyren both had modest, good production.
Well, modest productions, but not exactly to what it was last season. But the idea is that, for me, my theory was select running backs that I realized that in the offensive schemes that they operating from, they're going to be involved in both passing and running. So the volume should definitely be there. But since week one, not all that volume was there, but a lot of teams were leaning on their run game. Just think about the Houston Texans. A guy I was able to pick up, Joe Mixon. I mean, he did a lot of damage, and a lot of fantasy owners were disappointed that, hey, Christian McCaffrey didn't play because it was a calf, Achilles injury, but Jordan Mason racked up 146 yards. Who saw that coming? If you saw that coming, you knew the ending of the usual suspects, and no one knew the ending of that. So Jordan Mason ends up being Kaiser Soze in fantasy football.
Well, listen, this is a Shanahan thing. We've gone over that a number of times on the podcast, and your connection to the family, playing for Mike. Before we have Jordan Mason, there's Alfred Morris. Before there's Alfred Morris, there's Reuben Drones. Before there's Reuben, I mean, this is what the offense does. But what I think is interesting, and what we weren't necessarily, we were kind of taking blindly, and we can throw the LA Rams into this as well. The injury reports throughout the month of August, they don't matter. Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers offense were telling us that it's a calf, that it's just a strain. He was limited in practice. Meanwhile, the LA Rams, Puka Nakua's knee, it's a bursa sac. It's a minor, acute, rare knee injury. For all we know, it was always an Achilles for McCaffrey, and it was always a PCL for Puka. But there's no requirement for these teams to fully disclose these things to not only opposing teams, but to their fans and fantasy football players. So it's an adjustment. Correct me if I'm wrong, but last year I took the discount on Cooper Kupp, thinking that his injuries coming into the season would clear up after a couple of weeks. Turned out there was a setback, and they didn't. And then this year I draft Puka Nakua, thinking that it's a minor injury, and there's a setback that lands him on IR in his first half of football this season. So it's difficult to track, not only the lack of production or predict it, Kaiser Sose, but it's also teams aren't necessarily held to the same standards in terms of documenting and reporting the injuries that we will now see as they are fully scrutinized throughout the course of the regular season, Nick.
Yeah, but let's be totally honest. I mean, your guy Bill Belichick made it infamous, and he was great at doing this, playing the waiver wire and saying, okay, well, a guy may play, he may not play, never really meeting on to the severity of the injury, and sometimes putting healthy guys on the injury report just to throw teams off. So most coaches say, look, we're coaching for our team. We can give two nickels about the fantasy owners and trying to make sure that they set their rosters. So, yes, could there be some truth about what happened with Puka or Christian McCaffrey? Absolutely. But those coaches, we don't have to acquiesce to you fans. We really don't care. We're in the business of cloak and dagger. We want to keep things as secret as we can, but we see that those two players out. But it opens up an opportunity for other players on said roster. Jordan Mason took advantage of it against Robert Saleh and the New York Jets. The fact was trying to figure out, well, who's going to be that new player of this week in week 2.
So part of predicting that, right? We don't know the injuries. We don't know. There's so many variables. Nick, from your experience, when you see how certain defenses play, not just with week 1, but we see certain things that we saw a year ago. For example, one of the only team that had 4 passing touchdowns, Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, took advantage of a Washington Commanders defense that was among the worst defending the pass last year, and we're seeing that again. So are we just saying that any team that's playing against the Commanders is an automatic start? Does that mean that with the New York Giants coming down to our nation's capital, Daniel Jones and Malik Neighbors are all in play now all of a sudden compared to the 6 points that we just saw them put up against Minnesota? When you put the Commanders in there, I asked because you mentioned Robert Saleh and the Jets, right? There's a $150 that Jordan Mason has yards from scrimmage against a Jets defense that's just poorly coached from Robert Saleh. So, I mean, do you hang your hat on the teams that just cannot stop the run? That's, the Jets, the Bengals, and those that can't defend the pass. That was the Eagles, the Commanders, and just, again, anytime your players play the Panthers, you have to play them.
Well, for me, it's about matchups of the week, and they change from week to week. I'll start with Carolina that you mentioned, because the Carolina Panthers, they didn't play well on the road against Derek Carr and the Saints, and we saw what happened there. And the Chargers, who they faced this week, beat up on the Raiders and Gardner Minshew. So if you are looking to stream a defense, to me, you want to go and stream the Chargers against Carolina because
Yeah.
that seems like it's an easy win. It's almost like being a fifth grader going out to the sandbox and just taking some kids' juice box. That's an easy victory, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what you look at.
So I'd played the Chargers last week against the Raiders because I wasn't very optimistic with Gardner Minshew, and that turned out fine. But that also extends to J.K. Dobbins, who's owned,
Yes.
he was owned in about 50, 60% of Yahoo leagues. And if he was a free agent, he was the top waiver priority because he had broken those two big runs. He had the majority of the backfield work for the Chargers. I think it was only 10 carries, but still managed 133 yards. And now he goes up against a Panthers defense that just lost Derek Brown for the year. So look, J.K. Dobbins was either stashed on the end of your bench, one of your later picks, or you just picked him up off waivers. For your team, Nick, you're probably not going to bench one of Joe Mixon, Kyron Williams, or Bijan Robinson. But I mean, J.K. Dobbins is this is kind of the example I was searching for, is a guy who handled 10 rushes but had very good production off of it, albeit off of 2 long runs. Is he an automatic start? A running back one, a top 12, maybe top 15 running back, just for the fact alone that he's playing the Carolina Panthers?
Yes, yes, and yes again.
Okay.
I live in a world of, okay, if a guy does well and he was, I guess, unexpected to do as well as he did in a game, to me, I want to give it another week to see if he's able to produce the same level of production in the week before. But knowing as though you're facing against the Carolina Panthers, yes. And it's just like, if you, whatever wide receiver, whatever defense, whatever you have facing the Carolina Panthers, you start all of them this week until Dave Canellis and his quarterback Bryce Young shows you anything different. But J.K. Dobbins was definitely one of those players. And immediately when I saw him break off the first run, I was trying to put a waiver claim into him right away. But there was someone else who was a priority over me, so they were able to secure him. But this is the great thing about the season in fantasy football, as I see it, because some people are in dynasty leagues where or keeper leagues where you just stuck with your players. I'm not in those types of leagues.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm always watching games just to see which player that I didn't anticipate that would somewhat do something where I say, you know what? I'm projecting weeks from now that player is going to be a go-to player. Maybe I should add him to my roster. I'm constantly looking for players to add to my roster. But great production by J.K. Dobbins. Let's see if he can duplicate that again against the Panthers.
So I want to use that as an example. And I said this at the top of the show. You can go somewhere else for, answer your start-sit questions, all this and that. I just sort of want to broaden the conversation around fantasy football and leverage your experience, Nick, when it comes to roster and lineup decisions. So we'll take the examples of the 2 running backs we've spent the most time on, right? J.K. Dobbins, the road, Carolina, Jordan Mason against the Vikings. I'm not saying which do you prioritize one over the other. I guess what I'm asking for is when you had that type of decision, if it's Mason versus Dobbins, or if it's any running back that you drafted outside of the top 15, right? You didn't draft Jonathan Taylor and sit him on the bench. You didn't draft Bijan Robinson to have him sit on the bench. I understand that. But when you look at matchups, when you look at how much opportunity they had, their success, their production from the previous game, their previous track record going years back, how, what's your chart, your flow, your organizational flow, your chart that says, I'm going to factor the fact that, well, Jordan Mason had more carries, had more rushing yards, had 1 touchdown compared to J.K. Dobbins, who didn't handle the rock as much, who didn't have as many yards, but he was more efficient. Well, the Panthers are, the Vikings have a better defense than the Panthers do, but they're still susceptible to the run because Brian Flores is all in or out with the pass rush. You have all of these things kind of swirling around in your head. Well, Jim Harbaugh wants to run the football with the Chargers. Oh, Kyle Shanahan is going to put the ball in Brock Purdy's hands. Like, how do you sort of break down all of these variables when it comes to deciding which running back to go to. Maybe this is a bad example because the answer is always going to be, yeah, play the guy that's playing against the Panthers. I'm just, what factors kind of weigh in for you when it comes to their previous production, their coaching style, their pace of play, and the opponent that they're facing for an upcoming week?
Well, since we're talking about running backs, I always look at the defense that they're playing and just ask myself, well, how do they do last week or season leading up to that point as far as yards given up on the ground? And then I also look at the running back and say, okay, well, is this a tandem or three-headed monster type of backfield? Because you're thinking about carries. In the case of Jordan Mason, yeah, you're playing against the Vikings. And I can tell you the Vikings have tried so many ways since Sunday to try to slow down Kyle Shanahan in their running attack. But because they coach their technique so well, it makes it really difficult. And what we don't know at this particular point, you're saying, okay, well, if will Christian McCaffrey play? Because you're wondering, okay, how many, I guess, splits as far as carries are there going to be? Because it's about
Well, I guess in this example, the reporting, I think this was Adam Schefter on Monday night and others saying that it's unlikely McCaffrey would play, because I would imagine that if they're going to put him on the field, he's going to get all the touches, and then it becomes a no-brainer. Christian McCaffrey, you play him. So I guess in this example, you go with Jordan Mason, and that's the other variable, right? We have more of a track record with J.K. Dobbins than Jordan Mason. At the same time, that also carries an injury risk that Jordan Mason doesn't have. So all of these things, and I appreciate you weighing in, Nick, is sort of filtering through, understanding, what it is and sort of prioritizing. You look to the opposing defense first, you see how they've done previously, and then it comes down to the profile of the player on your roster. You're trying to, decide between one or the other. Nick, any other players or thoughts that you have coming off of week one? I'm not going to overreact to Drake London and the Falcons. I hate that offense, but I'm not trying to trade away Drake London just yet. I know that the Falcons are hopefully going to get right when the other guy with the Achilles injury, Kirk Cousins, is feeling more like himself. But who are we not going to overreact to just yet, Nick?
Well, I would look at the tight end position. Dallas Goedert, he got you over 7 points in fantasy football. Evan Ingram did not. It just seemed as though Trevor Lawrence found some different targets to distribute the ball to.
So there were 3-4 tight ends that I think had over 10 PPR points for week one. And your week one tight end leader for last season, Nick, was it? I think it was it Dallas Goedert? It was Hunter Henry. So all I'm saying, folks, is let's be patient with the position, right? If you went zero tight end, if you didn't reach for one of the elite guys this year, good on you. If you are starting Mark Andrews right now, Nick, you're not in a full panic, are you? I think the Chiefs took him away. Isaiah Likely was the other top waiver pickup this year. I prefer Dobbins. Personally, I have the top waiver claim in one league. I picked Dobbins because it seemed more sustainable to me. I think if you're going to have a one starter position like tight end, I want a modest floor. And Isaiah Likely clearly showed us his ceiling, but I am not ready to get on that roller coaster for tight end 1 versus tight end 25 next week, depending on how defenses align with Mark Andrews or not. I guess with that position, I just look to see who's out there running routes, which was why I targeted Colby Parkinson a lot in drafts, because he was going to run the full route tree for the Rams, something he wasn't doing in Seattle. They gave him money this offseason, and sure enough, it's modest work. They get 4 catches and about 40 yards. That's about as good as you could do for that position for week one.
Well, since we're talking about tight ends, I think last season a lot of fantasy owners were upset about the production of Atlanta Falcons tight end Kyle Pitts. I thought, with Zach Robinson coming in, and whether it was Penix or Kirk Cousins, that the numbers and the volume would be higher for a guy like Kyle Pitts. But in the game against Pittsburgh, where they should have used him so much to really stretch that defense, they did not. And hopefully this is not, early warning signs that we're going to have a second year of Kyle Pitts underachieving? Hopefully that's not the case.
I think it's year 3 now after his rookie season where he recorded 1,000 yards. It'd be 3 years in a row underachieving. But again, we're not going to overreact. Nick, before we split, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we talked about the lack of quarterback production. And of course, that was maybe best highlighted by a number of the young quarterbacks, that included second-year guys like Will Levis and sixth-year guys like Daniel Jones. But the 3 rookie quarterbacks, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, Caleb Williams, the 3 of them combining for 415 passing yards. Nix kind of bailed out some of their fantasy production with the use of their legs. But Nick, before we split, I got to ask that Bo Nix debut, that Caleb Williams debut, I'm going to hone in on those 2 in particular and maybe have you lean towards your Denver Broncos. But, I mean, we're not calling this draft class a bust now, are we, after we hailed them as one of the best that we've seen since 2003 or, something along those lines? Hopefully not.
Well, I'm not calling them any of them a bust because I understand how this works. That's not to say that people here in Denver, those people being certain media members and more importantly, certain members of the fan base, because there's a level of excitement that was built up for Bo. Bo did not play in the last preseason game. And I'll let you know my details on that. So this is not one of those situations where you don't need to panic. And after week 1, you're calling the guy a bust. To me, it says a lot about the individuals making those statements and their ability to be patient, but their football IQ, because a lot of rookie players, especially at quarterback, don't perform well in week 1. Rarely do we see a guy who's drafted number 1 overall or in the top 10 win their first game, and especially Bo playing in Seattle on the road. No, there were a bunch of homers here with the networks and the radio stations. Oh, go Broncos. And they only did that to kind of tear the kid down. And I knew it was going to be a very tall task for him. But each one of those quarterbacks get a chance to bounce back. Caleb Williams, first overall pick, say whatever you want to say about his performance. Guess what? He emerged victorious, which proves that quarterbacks are not the only thing that's important when it comes to determining wins and losses.
This is revisionist history too, because in my mind I'm thinking, well, C.J. Stroud, clearly the exception of the rule. His week 1 outing against the Baltimore Ravens, the offense scored 9 points, so no touchdowns, 242 passing yards, no touchdowns, no picks. So again, we even have to be patient with C.J. Stroud for how good that he is. But I guess because this is the Fantasy Friday, Nick, Washington's pass catchers, the wide receivers, combined for 7 catches for 45 yards. Chicago's pass catchers, Denver's pass catchers, Washington's, until we see it with these rookies, are you leaning towards benching the likes of DJ Moore, Roma Dunze, Terry McLaurin, Cortland Sutton? Where are you kind of at, or are you just willing to take the lumps as these rookies kind of navigate, their professional careers?
Look, man, if you have a player who's a wide receiver and there's a rookie quarterback that's throwing him the ball, hey, God bless you. And you're just going to have to suffer and really be patient with the level of execution because this is a learning curve. I'm going to say this. Those guys are probably they may underachieve at the beginning of the season, but maybe starting week 4 and beyond, things change because Roma Dunze, I think he might have suffered a slight injury in that game, in the Chicago game. So he's a very talented guy. They're going to find a way to get him the ball. And by the way, he is wide receiver number 3 to DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. So I would be in that. Once again, when you think about McLaurin and you think about Cortland Sutton, rookie quarterbacks that show a lot of promise in college, it's just a matter of the offensive coordinators keeping the offense in a rhythm and finding ways to feature those 2 guys in the offense. If that happens, I mean, those guys are going to have numbers, but they may not be numbers that really, truly jump off the page. But still, it's about getting those guys involved and keeping them involved.
Well, it's funny because the Bears have the early bye this year. Week 7, they're off. They come back And we've got a number 1 pick facing a number 2 pick, Bears Commanders, later in October. He's Nick Ferguson. I'm Alex Hardy. We are those guys. We hope to continue to be your guys, especially here on a Fantasy Friday. We'll be here each and every Friday. Just look at the bigger picture of how things fall out from the previous week, plus looking ahead to the upcoming weekend. Nick Ferguson, it's a pleasure as always, at Nick Ferguson _25. What do you have to say to the people before we head on out of here?
It is another game week, and don't make the mistake that I made. Do not go to the pizza counter and ask for anchovies. Don't do it. It's not a good thing.
No. That's just bad breath. That's just bad breath, Nick. Thank goodness for doing this over Zoom.